What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video and like what you're seeing, make sure you hit the like button, please, and let me know what you think in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you living under a rock, or you just haven't done it yet, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another sit down video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to talk about another mafia topic. And as we know, when we talk about the Gambino crime family, it's hard to not talk about the Dapper Don, John Gotti. As we know, his regal, his snappy dressing, and his overall leader attitude is something that we can't not talk about. But it's interesting that after the reign of the Gottis, there's not a lot said about what the Gambino family looked like. As we know, Gotti Sr., then Jr., and then his brother Peter would take over. But there's a very underrated individual we're going to talk about today, a guy that would take the family through a couple different problems in the late 90s, early 2000s. We are going to talk about the life and times of the very fascinating Arnold Zeke Squitieri next on Sit Down Short. Zeke Squitieri was born February 2nd, 1936 in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. As we know, Englewood Cliffs is directly across the river from New York City. And as a young boy, he would become acquainted with another fellow Italian, Alphonse Sisca. Sisca was in his 20s and 30s. He would become a very high-end heroin dealer and was identified as in the federal government as a major heroin distributor, not only to white groups, but also to black organized crime as well. He and Squitieri would head a small heroin ring in North Jersey that was quickly taking over the streets. What they were basically doing was they were getting their heroin through the Bonanno crime family. The Bonanno family was getting it through their associations with the Catroni crime family in Montreal from Europe, and they were getting very pure cocaine and heroin that they were distributing into the streets. And Cisco was identified as a major supplier in the 70s. Now, in 1970, though, Arnold Squitieri would have to face the government for the first time. He would be wanted in a case in a murder involving an individual called Desiderio Caban. He was a Latin garment worker who got into a beef with Squitieri. Squitieri would, according to witnesses, kill him on the street, and then was said to have bribed the police to let him go, and that, quote, the boys would figure things out. They would actually comply, take the bribe, and let Squitieri go. They would ultimately be hemmed up in a bribery case, and Squitieri would turn himself in. He would ultimately plead guilty to manslaughter and, as well as a tax charge, get 6 years in prison. So he would get lucky and beat the murder rap, I guess, due to a faulty witness. According to the affidavit, one of the witnesses was a teenager. So I guess they called into question what he actually saw. Maybe he was a little worried about who he was dealing with at that point and decided to tell his story a little bit differently. He would head up to jail, and Squitieri would ultimately be released in 1981. What does he do? As usual, he heads right back to his boyhood chum, Alphonse Sisca. They begin selling narcotics with high-ranking members of the Gambino crime family. It was said by this point Sisca was a major player in New Jersey and was said to be the representation for the Gotti faction in New Jersey. They would begin selling heroin through Genie Gotti, brother of John Gotti, and Angelo Quack Quack Ruggiero. As we know, they would go against the family's policy on selling heroin and begin doing it. One of their main connections was Sisca and Squitieri, and they would head that kind of part of this. They would begin selling large amounts of drugs. And in fact, at one point, when the government would bug the famous pink phone in the bedroom of Ruggiero's daughter, Squitieri would actually be caught on wiretap discussing what the FBI thought was a deal. They would uncover coded language that whenever Ruggiero and Squitieri were discussing going to get a hot dog, that would mean basically they were going to, pass off drugs to each other and or money. So it was a pretty interesting deal that was set up, but ultimately they would all be caught up, as we know. And this would set up a problem for Gotti because Gotti was concerned about the fact that these guys were dealing behind the scenes, and that would go against boss of the family's, Paul Castellano's, edict on not selling drugs. And this would ultimately lead to one of the reasons that Gotti would probably take out Castellano in the mid-'80s. Ultimately, for Gene Gotti and Carneglia and Quack Quack Ruggiero, many of them would get long prison sentences, including Carneglia, and Gene Gotti. For Siska and Squitieri, they would go to jail as well. Zeke would actually get 11 years in prison. And that would not stop Zeke and or Siska from selling drugs. They would begin selling drugs again. In fact, Siska was actually caught on wiretap in federal prison in the late 80s discussing with an individual called Richard Pasqua that he would sell him a kilo of heroin once he got out because, quote, he was going to go right back to his connections in the Gotti crew and begin selling heroin. He would comply and sell the kilo to Pasqua. The only problem was Pasqua was a government informant, and that would give Siska a lot of problems. So these guys were big-time drug dealers and had really been big-time drug dealers for the past 20 or so years. Upon getting arrested, though, in 1986, John Gotti would actually make Arnold Squitieri a made man in the Gambino crime family. It was said by people that knew Gotti well that he really enjoyed Arnold Squitieri. Squitieri was said to enjoy gambling just like Gotti did, and they were regularly seen at Aqueduct Racecourse blowing thousands of dollars on the ponies on any given day. There was a key to John Gotti's heart. We've talked about this before. One of the things John loved to do was gamble. And if you like to gamble, you didn't have to be good at it. If you like to gamble, you could be close with Gotti. That's one of the reasons Squitieri was said to be liked by Gotti. Let's remember also, Zeke Squitieri was someone that was ultimately a hitman and a drug dealer and an earner for Gotti. But I think Gotti realized quickly he could trust Zeke, and maybe down the road he could act as a pretty good emissary in his family. One of the reasons John Jackie Knows D'Amico was close with Gotti was the fact that Jackie Knows enjoyed gambling. It's just that simple. If you liked gambling, Gotti pretty much liked you. It's pretty simple. So he would head away for 11 years, would Zeke Squitieri, and he would get out in the late 90s. By that point, he was a made man in the family. Now, as we know, in 1992, boss John Gotti would go away and he would give the control of the family over to his son, Junior Gotti. And as we know, that would cause some friction in the family. It was said that there was a bit of a triumvirate at the top of the family, including Junior, brother Peter Gotti, and obviously James Jimmy Brown Failure. Now, the ultimate decision maker was Junior Gotti. Once Junior goes away in 99, the control of the family would go solely to Peter Gotti. And look, Peter Gotti was not a leader. He should not have been the leader of the Gambino crime family, but Gotti could trust him, and it all worked out, and he was able to take the family, I guess, through some turbulent time. The problem was he wasn't a good boss, and no one liked him, including Squitieri. Squitieri and him butted heads a lot because by this point, Squitieri was named underboss to Peter. They would butt heads. They didn't seem to like each other. In fact, it didn't seem like many people like Peter Gotti. I know Mikey Scarsdi Leonardo butted heads with him as well at one point. But once Peter Gotti goes away in 2002, the sole responsibility of the family would come to Zeke Squitieri. He would go from heroin dealer to confidant to Gotti and the Gotti boys to taking the family out of the Gotti regime and into present day. We have to look back at Squitieri as a main conduit and really taking the family to where it currently is. It's a pretty powerful group. Squitieri was the first person to lead the family after the three Gottis were in control. So Squitieri takes over, and he believes that he has a pretty decent time ahead of him. He's the boss. He's making money. Everything's good. The next problem that would present itself became an arcing problem for the entire mafia, particularly the Gambinos and the Lucchese crime family. It would be the creation of a group called the Corporation, headed by this individual, a Macedonian-born ethnic Albanian called Alex Rudai. Rudai was heading a violent organization that basically had it in their heads they were more dangerous than the Italians. They would respect the Italians, but they were going to do what they wanted to do. They were going to take over card games. They were going to take over territory. They were going to become the sixth family. And this would present a two-arcing problem, one for the Gambinos and for one Lucchese's. Lucchese's decided almost that they were just going to wipe the floor with these people. But the Gambinos would take a different tack, particularly Arnold Squitieri and Greg De Palma. Now, De Palma was a Kappa regime that was up in the Westchester, Bronx area, and he was familiar with these Albanians. In fact, some of the Gambino family, people that were in the Albanian group, were actually one time close with Greg De Palma, including an individual called Lenny or Nardino Coletti. So Squitieri and De Palma decide, you know what, let's try to take a little more peaceful approach with these people. We'll try to sit down with them, try to make things right. We're not just going to go kill them like the Lucchese's wanted to do. So Zeke Squitieri tries to kind of quell these problems with the Albanians. He would set up a meeting with Zeke Squitieri at a New Jersey gas station in 2005. By this point, the Albanians were out of control. They were running through territory. They were robbing places. They were becoming a big issue. And Squitieri would go to the gas station with about 20 individuals. Rudai and his group set up with about 6 people. And they would have a kind of desperado face-off in the gas station. And according to Jack Garcia, who we're going to talk about in a second, Jack Garcia became a very interesting individual. He was an FBI agent who would infiltrate the family. He was tracking Greg De Palma. He would talk about that Squitieri would come face to face with the Albanians, and the Albanians basically said, look, we will blow this entire fucking gas station up with everybody in it. We don't give a shit about anything. We're going to get rid of you all. But he was outnumbered, Rudai, and he basically got to the point where Squitieri kind of made peace with them and said, look, if you don't stop, they're going to fucking just destroy all of you. And that was that. And ultimately, Rudai and his people would get jammed up, and they still sit in federal prison till about 2035 due to their crime. So they would go away because the federal government would jam them up. So Zeke Squitieri kind of was able to take the family through the more peaceful approach to all of this. He would, though, face a real problem, and that would be Jack Garcia. By this point, Garcia, who was a federal agent of Cuban descent, would infiltrate the operations of Greg De Palma, and they were becoming very chummy. De Palma was a chatterbox, and he was saying a lot of stuff to Jack Garcia. Garcia was said to be very trusted, and this would be the first time the FBI would really infiltrate a family since the Donnie Brasco situation in the 80s. Now, I want to talk about a pretty interesting story that Jack Garcia would actually tell me. I've spoke to Garcia a few times. He's a pretty cool guy. We've had some cool conversations. He would actually tell this story publicly as well, involving Arnold Squitieri. In 2005, to kind of try to hem the Gambino family up on some things, Garcia was always given electronics and jewelry and all sorts of things. He was fencing them and giving them to people in the Gambino family. He got a load of TVs at one point, and he gave a television to the boss, Zeke Squitieri. One night, Garcia is sleeping when he gets a call from Gregory De Palma. And Greg De Palma basically is in a frazzle and says, hey, that TV you gave the boss, where'd you get that? Was that stolen or what? Jack Garcia would respond, but basically, of course it's stolen. I didn't go to Kmart and buy it. What do you think? And De Palma would respond basically that Squitieri had actually seen an episode of The Sopranos where a character called Feech LaManna got jammed up with stolen televisions, and that he was worried that the FBI was bugging the TV and that they would come and take him away for it. So he called De Palma and said to tell that Falcone and Garcia to, quote, get that goddamn TV off my wall. And the next day, Garcia removed the TV from Squitieri's home. And Garcia would talk about that. Squitieri actually realized that life was imitating art and that they were going to come and arrest him for the stolen television. Now, ultimately, they didn't, but it's just a funny story that Garcia would tell many years later. Ultimately, for Zeke Squitieri, the party would end in 2005, late 2005. He would be indicted for multiple crimes, including extortion of the construction industry, illegal bookmaking, and tax evasion. And really, by the end, Zeke Squitieri would go away. In 2006, he would be sentenced to just over 7 years in federal prison. He would actually survive, though, and would get out in 2012 and really return to relative anonymity. Now, interestingly enough, Zeke Squitieri really from the last 8 or 9 years, we hadn't heard much from Zeke Squitieri. However, just recently, in fact, last week, Zeke Squitieri actually passed away of natural causes, and is really one of the last old school people from the Gambino crime family. As we know, there are still some present day people still alive. Most of them have become in relative anonymity, including Squitieri, John Gotti, Jackie D'Amico. In fact, after Squitieri went away, Jackie Knows D'Amico would head street duties in the Gambino crime family. According to people that I know, he is said to be kind of not on the shelf, but he's inactive as well. A lot of these older Gambino guys are good as gone at this point, and Squitieri would meet the Grim Reaper just last week. An interesting guy, though, nonetheless. We don't talk about him much, but he really kind of positioned himself as kind of the heir apparent after the Gotti regime and did some good things for the family. He would ultimately, in the Gambino relay race, pass the torch off to the current administration. As always, if you enjoy my videos, make sure you hit the like and subscribe buttons. We'll see you next time here on the Sit Down. Thanks.